So this is the title of our project, Attacking with Something That Does Not Exist. And I'm going to give a quick outline of the work, then talk a bit about the background and the attack itself, what we actually evaluated, and then we have some additional work. Let's see how time works out. So basically, in 2023, the CVE was registered with an attack that we coined the NSEC3 enclosure attack. And that basically meant that they used a mechanic in the DNS that would lead to CPU load and subsequently to denial of service on DNS resolvers. And because we're interested in these kind of topics, we thought we wanted to develop a system to evaluate this attack, investigate whether we could actually improve the attack, make it worse, and do an evaluation of the exploit that actually tries to find out how we can actually achieve DOS on the DNS resolvers. I'm sure most of you should have heard of this, but I'm going to explain it anyway for completeness sake. So the domain name system is basically the hierarchical and distributed database for most of the things that you can find on the web. So it contains these so-called domain names, in this case example.com, and usually you can use it to find servers or IP addresses or any kind of data that is associated and linked in the DNS. And it basically works, and this is important that you have this distribution between clients in the network, and then you have resolvers that actually do the work of looking up where something is located. And those resolvers are typically run by your ISP, by your local company's local network. And what happens is when a client wants to know where something exists, it asks the resolver. The resolver then goes down these tree structure servers. So it first asks the root. It doesn't know where it is, so it sends you to the next layer. That again is asked about the resource that you want to find. Again, referral to the last one, and then if you find the server that is actually authoritative for some resource, you get the answer, and the resolver can relay that answer back to the client that originally asked. Now, non-existence in DNS, so there exists a couple of extensions that we call DNS security extensions. And there are basically two options on how to prove that something doesn't exist in the DNS, and those are NSEC and NSEC3. And an NSEC that mainly happens in a form of a linked list over the zone structure. So for any single domain, you can say, hey, there is a domain here, a.b.example, and the next domain in the tree would be ns1.example, and that proves that there exists nothing in between that would be canonically sorted in between those domain names in this zone. And there was a problem associated with this because basically this allows you to jump along this linked list and basically find out about the entire structure of a zone. And that was mitigated with the invasion of NSEC3. In this, you no longer had the plain domain names, but instead hashes. And you would obfuscate that entire tree structure into a single level. And the advantage was nobody could find out because there exists pre-image resistance what the domain names in the zone actually were. But on the other hand, this required a more elaborate way to actually prove and validate it resolver side if some resource actually does not exist. And how that works is basically called the closest enclosure proof in NSEC3. I'm not going to explain it fully, but the gist of it is that you have to find a pair of two subnames of the query name, mainly the enclosure that must exist, and the next closer name that doesn't exist. And if you know these two, then you know that nothing beneath that pair of names does actually exist in the zone. And handily, the RFC that defined NSEC3 also defined an algorithm to do this, and it works basically by hashing the name, seeing if we found the pair already, and then if not, we remove a label and then try the thing again. Furthermore, there are two parameters in NSEC3 that the zone operator can define. First, it's the iterations. So if we set the iterations level to something that is higher than 0, it basically instructs the zone operator, but also the resolvers, that when they want to compute a single hash, they have to rehash any number of times that the iterations say. And again, with a salt value, these instructions say that whenever you do a hash operation for computing the final hash, you must also append a value that is up to 255 bytes for every single iteration. And this is supposedly making any dictionary attacks harder, but this also leads to the fact that the expected closer and closer proof complexity starts being in the order of number of labels of a domain name and the times of iterations that you have to compute, and also the length of the salt. And the limits that have been defined are actually up to 2,500 iterations in the original RFC and SEC3 draft. And this allowed to construct attacks like this. So as an attacker, you send a query to some vulnerable resolver, where you demand the non-existence to know for some kind of domain, which has presumably more than 100 labels. And the resolver would then try to query the zone name server, the authoritative name server, and that would respond with NSEC3 records that would maximize this kind of workload. So for example, 150 iterations and a very long salt. And the hope is that you can then denial of service that resolver, because it has to do a lot of validating work, and the more queries you send to it, the more validation work that piles up. And the question is whether you can delay or maybe even DOS the entire system this way. Now, this kind of attack hasn't been new. I'm not going to read out all of the quotes here, but basically in August 2022, the RFC9276 came out, and that said, well, most of those things actually don't provide that much security after all, and they make it actually a kind of vulnerable, so they have been discouraging the use of iterations and salt all the way 2 years ago. But still, to this day, we found out that, the resolvers still allow a certain limit of iterations and salt in terms of compatibility. So what we then did was we created a system that allowed us to create large-scale zones that look like this on the right, that would produce a consistent result whenever they were queried on a name server with NSEC3 records, always 3 included. And so you would have the static zone file that would be hosted on any kind of name server out there. And then, in turn, the resolvers that you would target could then be tested against these kind of zone files. And we also built a setup where we could containerize the resolvers, run certain attack scenarios, and then measure how they respond and try to figure out what the impact of this attack was. We looked at the big 4 DNS vendors, namely Bind, Unbound, PowerDNS, and Not. And before any of the attack has been patched, the attack is from 2023, so by now there have been some iterations to these kind of limits. They have been limiting the iterations to 150. This is the key important figure. And we also run tests on the Bind 9 version 9.16.1, which is quite a bit older now. But it has still the RFC5155 limits of 2,500 iterations, just as a comparison of how bad this attack could actually scale. And these were the results that we first found out. So on the graphs, you can see when we scale up the number of iterations. And here on the left, you would have attack rates, so queries that the attacker sends to the resolvers of up to 150 packets per second, which is rather a lot. But you can see that if you increase the number of iterations, you can also see this beautiful linear increase in workload that resolvers experience. And that ends with the value that is above the 150 value, in this case for the unbound version. And on the right, we have the older version of Bind 9, which is running 9.16.1. And you can see that already at around 8 queries per second, the CPU would already be maxed out. And even more so, you have the limit of 3,000 iterations that would still be accepted for some reason at this resolver that would achieve full CPU maximization. Then on the next step, we try to find out, well, what happens if we put a salt to this? So by adding a salt, you can see that we find that this attack actually gets worsened. So each iteration, the salt has to be applied. And because the way hash functions process longer inputs, that also leads to more computational load on the cryptography of validating responses. So we can see that the scaling actually works along with taking longer salts into the NSEC3 responses. And that leads to the fact that Bind 9 actually gets maxed out at around 4 to 5 queries per second in terms of CPU load. And you can also see that it drags on well beyond when the attack has already concluded, still processing attacker queries and experiencing high load. In the next step, we wanted to compare how the actual resolvers compare between each other. So these were just nitpicks before, and now we have a comparative overview of all of the resolvers. And you can see there's actually quite a bit of divergence that we can find. So for some of the resolvers, they were more resilient against specific scenarios, and other resolvers were far more vulnerable in terms of CPU load. So for instance, bind, we measured the highest CPU load, which in return meant that you needed only a lower attack query rate per second in order to actually maximize out the CPU load on the resolver. But what was interesting is that this actually changed in behavior when we applied a solve. So the order still remained, but it got much closer together. Now, you don't have to understand all of it at first from these kind of graphs, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can translate a CPU load into actual loss on the resolvers, because a denial of service would mean that other responses get blocked because the resolver is unresponsive because it is working on cryptography all of the time. So we also wanted to analyze that. And what we did is we found the maximum rate at which the resolver was experiencing loss when we tried to query it with another client. And that happened to be at the maximum of 150 per second, which was the limit of the setup, where we could reliably produce consistent measurements. And also after that, it becomes less and less realistic for an attacker to achieve consistent attack rates. But we could see that we experienced a very mixed kind of pattern. So the delays immediately shot up on most resolvers as soon as they reach 100% CPU load, but not necessarily they all experience the same kind of loss. And if we put that into perspective, we can see that the column on the right here is actually how much loss we experienced during the attack duration. It varies greatly from power DNS, which only showed about 2.75% or 7.6 in this figure, and up to 35% roughly for unbound. So there was a huge spread, but also not as impactful as one would have guessed from the nature of the attack itself. So we didn't achieve a full DUS with this attack, and even though we made it a bit worse by finding that we could apply assault and actually increase the impact on resolvers. And these are actually quite high attack rates already. So there is a kind of trade-off that you can see, because at some point it might get less attractive to actually achieve a DUS based on the cryptography work and more in just querying something sensible. But still, the attacks were rather cheap, so it is not expensive for an attacker to run the self-hosted zone at some point, and you only need to prove the denial of existence, so there isn't much back and forth between name server of the attacker and the attacker client itself. So you can get high rates, but it's still a trade-off, and you don't achieve full DUS. What we also were interested in is trying to find, so we looked out in the internet, queried all of the Tranco top 1 million domains, and found out which of those domains were actually providing us with NSEC-free parameter values that would be susceptible to an attack. So for instance, this would allow an attacker to not use their own name server, but someone else's name server. And what we found was that of the 66,000 domains that were actually signed, so they used DNSSEC, 56% used NSEC, but 41% used NSEC-free. And of the ones that use NSEC-free, actually rather a lot of them, namely 77% or 78 rounded, actually had iterations value greater than 0. And we found a maximum of 500 iterations for a couple of zones. And of the zones that used assault, there was a median value of 8, but also a maximum value of 64. So it is not uncommon for zone operators to choose these kind of values, even though there are relatively few zones. But as an attacker, you can be selective on what to query. And there are zones out there that get regularly queried. That's why they were included in the data set that could actually utilize this kind of load on the resolvers themselves. So I'm trying to keep things short, so I'm going to the conclusion. what we did was we did this kind of evaluation. We tried to find out whether there was an impact of the US on DNS resolvers, and that would actually trigger that clients were dropped. And what we found out was, well, this kind of attack can result in high CPU load and can actually exhaust the resolvers, but with an attack rate in the low hundreds. And also, there was an impact on benign drop rates, but we only found an impact of up to around 35%. So the overarching conclusion was, well, there is impact, but it's only going US far, and there may be even more better opportunities to actually find something to the US DNS resolver. That's about it. Thank you.